Yes. Hello, folks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to YOSA Live Chats. I'm so excited to be with composer Jennifer Higdon today. I'm Troy Peters. I'm the music director of YOSA, Youth Orchestras of San Antonio. And Jennifer, I don't need to tell you about yourself, but I want to give a little introduction to you. So I'm going to share just a few things about your remarkable career. Jennifer Higdon's one of America's most acclaimed and most frequently performed living composers. She won the 2010 Pulitzer Prize in Music. She's won 3 Grammy Awards in 2010, 2018, and 2020. In 2018, she also won the Nemers Prize from Northwestern University, which is given to contemporary classical composers who have significantly influenced the field of composition. And then this year, the 2010 recording of her percussion concerto was inducted into the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. On top of all that, I'm happy to say that she's been a friend of mine for 33 years, and I'm really excited to be able to have Jennifer Higdon with us on YOSA Live Chats. Thanks for being here today, Jennifer.
It's good to be here. Good to share some time while we're all sitting in our homes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so one of the things that we often try to do is talk to people about their journey into a career in music. And I know that in your case, the story of how you found your way to becoming a composer is I think of it being a little bit unusual. You started later than a lot of people do. So could you tell us that story? How did you find your way to being a composer?
Absolutely. It is a bit of a journey. And I look back on the journey and I'm kind of shocked at how it's all traversed and gone through its own course. But basically, I taught myself to play the flute from a beginning band method book when I was about 15. So I was like entering high school and I joined the band. I played flute in the band, but I also played percussion. We moved people around. It was a competitive marching band. But I have to admit, going into my high school band experience, I had not really grown up around any classical music at all. My dad was a commercial artist who worked at home. So we had a tremendous amount of rock and roll, folk music, the early versions of reggae. That's what was the soundtrack of my household, the thing that I heard, because my dad worked at home. He was always playing music. So when I moved into the marching band, because that's primarily what we were, it was a big thing. And I loved it. I love the camaraderie. I love like hanging out with all these cool people. And it was a fantastic kind of click to have. It's that shared experience we all have in music. And I made the decision that I enjoyed it so much I wanted to major in music, but I was thinking I was going to do flute performance. I auditioned for a bunch of schools. I didn't get into any except one. Bowling Green State University in Ohio. So I went there. There's a fantastic flute teacher that was there, Judith Bentley. I had attended a high school music camp with her. And I remember thinking, wow, this lady knows how to teach. So it was a really good fit. But when I entered college, I knew absolutely nothing about classical music. It's kind of staggering now when I think about it. I had to take all the basic classes, basic theory. This is what ear training is. These are those keyboard skills that make you go through. And I started learning, but I was starting from ground zero. I mean, I knew absolutely nothing. I had all of these classmates who had been listening to the Beethoven symphonies, and they were talking about the Barbara Adagio for strings. And I was constantly having to look up in the library. This was pre-internet days, what these things were and learn about them. So it was like years and years of going through college and trying to catch up on repertoire. I was a flute performance major in my undergrad. Part of the way through my undergrad, my flute teacher had me write a little piece for a master class, and I loved doing that. And so then I started writing. I completed the bachelor's degree in performance, but writing started taking over my life. And then somehow I got into Curtis. I think the year I applied, maybe they only had 5 or 6 applicants and they took 3 people. So that was switching over to composition. And I still had so much to learn. It was incredible. I was probably behind absolutely everyone at Curtis. I think everyone walked into that school knowing a lot more than I did. I got an artist diploma from there and went up the street to the University of Pennsylvania. It was all composition up there, master's and doctorate. And I've kind of just been keeping at it. I mean, this is kind of how I've built a career. And when I'm writing pieces that I've never written for that instrument, or if it's repertoire like a piano trio where I don't know the piano trio repertoire, I literally have to study it. I have to experience it. I check the scores out, I check the recordings out, and I learn the repertoire. So I consider my life my lifelong goal is to learn as much as I can, but the more I learn, I don't know. So I just kind of keep going at it, but it keeps it interesting. It's always exciting.
Now, Jennifer, I remember even in your mid-20s when you were at Curtis, and I happened to be a classmate of yours. I also felt like everybody else there knew more than I did, by the way. But when I remember really vividly, even in your mid-20s when you were writing music there and when you moved over to the University of Pennsylvania, that performers responded to your music with a level of enthusiasm that honestly not all of our composing colleagues elicited. You have had this knack for a long time of writing music that performers respond favorably to. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that is. What is it about your music that has made performers respond so well to it?
It's a really good question. I've sometimes wondered that myself. I do have a lot of conversations with performers in terms of finding out, because I'm always writing on commission. I always want to know what they want in a piece. I think that's really important. But part of this was willing to take chances and make mistakes and learn, talk to my performers and figure out what didn't work on their instruments, or when I had asked too much of them, or like if I pushed the instrument too far. And part of this was also an empathy on my part, having been a performer and learned new works. There were certain simple things I realized I could control by getting the performers the music far enough in advance for them to learn it. Because I can't tell you how many performances I've done where we were taking the music straight from the composer, walking out on the stage and playing, which is not ideal on any level. But I've always been really concerned that things fit on instruments. So it's asking a lot of questions. But for me, it's also looking at other scores and figuring out how other composers handle instruments. And when I'm writing a concerto, which I think now I'm on concerto 14 or 15, ugh, I will also look at the repertoire and ask the performers, what was difficult on your instrument? What did other composers make the mistake of doing? Are you too covered in something? And what are the restrictions? Writing for harp was really different than writing a violin concerto. I mean, they're very, very different instruments. But one of the things I think that may help is the fact that I grew up on so much pop music. I like to have a clear beat in my music, even if it's a piece that's more atonal. But usually most of my stuff is pretty tonal, and I think it's melodic. I think it's fairly melodic. So I try to make sure that even if you play an instrument that doesn't normally get really interesting material, I think you should have really interesting material. I think it's my job to craft a great tuba part, great viola part. So sometimes the inner workings of an orchestra that don't normally get repertoire where they can play anything but offbeats or maybe held notes. I'm always interested in crafting lines that are interesting and engaging and rhythmic and something that people feel instinctively. And it's a lot of guesswork on my part. And you know what? Sometimes I make awful guesses, and sometimes it's a really serious miscalculation and I have to rewrite something or adjust it in rehearsals. But being open to that and having conversations with my performers is a big part of it. I think that makes a big difference. At least I hope so.
Well, and you're often writing these days for some of the greatest virtuosos in the world. So it's not like you have to worry about not writing music that's too difficult most of the time. And yet there's a difference between idiomatic and easy, right? Things can be difficult and still lie well on the instrument. I think of your violin concerto, and you won the Pulitzer Prize for this piece a decade ago now. Was Hilary Hahn a collaborator with you on that, in the sense that, you know, you would send things and she would say, I love this, maybe this is awkward, or you know, what was that relationship like?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I started her concerto, we met and I said, what do you want in the concerto? She didn't want to improvise a cadenza. She was clear about that. She said, I want a major piece. And I was like, what does that mean? How do you define a major piece? And she said, something that's 30 minutes long. So I thought, well, that is a major piece. So, but I have to admit, I looked at a lot of violin concertos and I looked at the repertoire she had selected for herself. She had just recorded the Schoenberg violin concerto, which I had always thought was unplayable. So I got that score out and I was like, wow, this was really hard. And one of the things that Hillary said is you let your imagination run. My job is to learn it, which is an incredible thing for someone to say. My music's fairly hard as it is, but when someone's telling me that, it really kind of lights a fire under me. And what I did was, she was traveling. She was always on the road in those days. I wrote one movement at a time and I would send it to her, usually through an assistant who would know where she was going to be headed so we could send a FedEx package. And she would try out that movement. and send back comments. And normally the comments that came back from her were, you can make it harder, which is kind of astounding because it wasn't that easy to begin
Right,
with. So,
right, right.
but even her saying that kind of egged me on a little bit to like push a little harder, you know. And so the first movement was the last movement that I ended up writing. And by the time I got to that movement, Hillary was like, you can write harder. And I thought, all right, what can I really do? She's throwing the gauntlet down. So I thought a lot about what a string player goes through with their fingers on the fingerboard. What kind of stretches would they have to be doing to be challenging? At what speed, what rhythm, and what kind of double stops would really challenge Hillary? And I wrote a cadenza that I thought wasn't playable. It was really up on the edge. And I sent her that movement, and there was like, I think it was like 2-week gap before I heard something, which was a considerable amount of time. And she said, yeah, it's hard, but I can do it. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And I remember telling her, if the cadenza is too hard, I can write another one. But I think she took it as a personal challenge. And it's amazing. Once one person does it, other violinists are like, oh, this is doable. So, I mean, I've had so many violinists do this piece. It's 10 years old. And I think I'm probably up to like 11 or 12 violinists have done it. Ben Beilman has been doing it all over the world. He's a Curtis graduate, and it's quite staggering. I mean, he's doing it all the time.
That's got to be a fascinating journey to have a piece of music that is taken up by so many different performers. And of course, your orchestral work, Blue Cathedral, is a tremendous example of that. It's a piece that's been played hundreds of times by almost all of the major American orchestras. I'm proud to say the YOSA Philharmonic has performed Blue Cathedral, but it's been done by youth orchestras. It's been done by all of the major orchestras in the US. What has it been like to have a piece like that that essentially becomes standard repertoire and hear it in the hands of so many different conductors and so many different orchestras?
It's actually magic. It's the very thing every composer dreams about, but you never think it could really happen. And I'm still amazed. I'm still amazed at how that piece resonates. And I love the fact that it's touched so many people. In many ways, I feel like that's not even my piece anymore. I feel like it belongs to the world in a certain way, but it's done all over the place. I mean, I'm amazed. I have to say, and orchestras also come back to it. I think the Philly Orchestra has actually played it now on 4 different occasions. So it's gone back quite a bit, but it's kind of that piece is emotional for me. But I also just marvel that a piece could go out throughout the world. I mean, the night before we did the first reading of that piece at Curtis, I remember I was really depressed. I thought it was going to be a failure. So it shows you composers are not always a great judge of these things.
Yeah, it's you never know, right? It's just
Right.
it's a crapshoot sometimes.
Yeah.
One of our YOSA musicians, Zora Dixon, who's actually the harpist of the YOSA Philharmonic, had a question about your harp concerto, and she wrote that you were able to showcase all aspects of the harp and to avoid the solo line being lost in a busy score for full orchestra. That's rare in the harp literature. So how did you achieve this?
Well,
how could you compose for the harp with the orchestra in such a way that it kept the harp from being overwhelmed and lost in the orchestra?
it's a really good question. That question about not covering an instrument is something I obsess over. But with a harp, it was really a bigger challenge than, say, writing for percussionists who are soloing. You have to really get the orchestra out of the way all the time. And what that means is when the instrument that's soloing is basically at the front of the stage and they have important material, you thin everything down extraordinarily. I thought about kind of the incredible sound the harp gets when they play a lot of notes, that kind of thing. I thought, wow, that's very rhythmic and that would cut through. But I tried to make sure that I always had everything on the thinner side in the orchestration. And I also, because the harp is so beautiful by itself, I made the decision to start the concerto with just the harp, so that the first movement opens so that you get a chance to just hear that sound kind of emerging. And so I was very, very careful to keep everything lighter. Whenever the harp was the main focus, not as many people are playing active rhythms. And one of the movements, the third movement, is actually a lullaby, is only for the harpist and 10 other solo instruments. So it's not even the entire orchestra. It's just principal players, basically. And writing that concerto was hard. I have to admit, it was really tricky. I looked at a lot of concertos, just about everything I could get my hands on. I also looked at the etudes that harpists played, the little sonatas. And Yolanda came to Philadelphia. We spent an afternoon together. I've always used harp in my orchestra pieces, but writing a concerto where you're featuring it, giving it enough musical material that it really is the central focus of everything that's happening on the stage, as opposed to just being accompanying. She came down and we met for like, I think it was like 4 hours, where she talked a lot about the difficulty she'd had in other pieces that have been written for her, the challenges, things I should watch out for, places where I might get a better sound out of the entire range of the harp. Where do they sound the best? And I even made some adjustments after the world premiere. It's unbelievably, the Rochester Philharmonic played the world premiere, and then we came back to it. That was in May, and we came back in September, and they opened their season with it. That's when we did the recording. So I was able to make some adjustments. But again, it's listening to my musicians. I would send off each movement to Yolanda, and she would look at it and let me know if there was any kind of a problem. And there were a couple of things I had to change the register because I was not as successful in the actual premiere with the harp projecting. But you have to respect the musicians, and you have to kind of love what you're doing to really sit there and go, oh, this could be awful. What am I writing here? It's always an anxiety with everything I write. I think, oh, I'm going to cover the person at the front of the stage. So somehow I've survived through all this time, but you have to always be willing to admit you've made a miscalculation and you got to make a quick adjustment.
Yeah, well, and I wonder about that, that you have the great benefit of your music being so widely performed, and so you have a chance to hear pieces. Are there times where a few years into the journey of a piece, you think, oh, you know what? I kind of wish I'd handled that moment just a little differently.
Yeah.
After you've heard it, 10 times or 40 times.
Yeah, I have to admit, all of my pieces have those moments, every single one. And I actually have a trombone concerto that I wrote back in, I believe it was in 2005 or 2006, that lived for a couple of years. It had a major premiere with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and it was out there for probably 5 or 6 years. And I was never comfortable with it, and I could never figure out how to improve it. And I ended up pulling it not that long ago because despite my best effort, the piece just never worked. It was like a really mediocre piece, not because of the instrument, but just the way I wrote the material. And fortunately, about 2 years ago, I had a commission for a low brass concerto for four players, 3 trombones and a tuba. And that was for the Chicago Symphony. And I was able to kind of go back into the brass thinking and rethink the way I had written lines and to figure out what might work better. So that's actually, but it's a perfect example of me pulling something, because I know the trombonists of the world are a little irritated with me. They frequently come up to me when I'm traveling and ask about it, but it wasn't a good piece. I mean, you have to be honest with yourself. Sometimes you're like, wow, that was a real awful experience. So let's just throw that out.
Yeah, that's a tough step to take, right? Because, you want to love all your children, even the ones who disappoint you. But
Yeah.
I
didn't do a good job raising that child in particular.
Excellent. Well, another YOSA musician actually had a question, and this is from a violinist named Hunter Messick, who's also a composer. And it's the classic question of writer's block. What do you do when the ideas won't come? How do you get through that? Or does that even happen to you?
It does. I think, this virus, this time we're all quarantined, is really kind of pointed to, I guess, the psychological and emotional distress level that has affected a lot of people's writing. For me, it gave me time to write. I can't write as many hours a day as I normally do when things are running normally, because my energy just runs out. But when you have writer's block, and I have had writer's block, the trick to that is making yourself write something, anything in a day, even if it's just one measure. If you can give yourself 15 minutes and write anything without judging it, because this is the hardest thing, is people often get like a masterpiece complex where they feel like what they're writing is not good enough. Beethoven did such a much better job of handling the string quartet. And you have to let that go. You cannot think about what all the people ahead of you have done, because the fact is you are unique. You are your own person, and you just have to get some notes on the page. And I always tell my students, and I remember this for myself, you can erase, delete, throw away anything you write. So you have to give yourself permission just to write some notes. I have found if you make yourself sit there until you write a certain amount, even if it's just a couple of measures, and you do that every day, it will unblock you. And you've got to be able to allow yourself permission to throw the piece away down the road. You might be surprised though, even when you're making yourself, right, it oftentimes has a good yield. And there have been plenty of times where I've sat down where I have to get something written because a musician is waiting and I'm not feeling particularly inspired on a day. But I found that if I sit down consistently and work on it every day, I tend to fall into a groove much faster and inspiration shows up. And I push through on the days where I don't feel inspired. That's quite all right, because a working composer is going to be writing music all the time. And it's not possible to really be inspired all the time.
Absolutely. I remember really vividly, again, back around the same time that you and I were in school together, that one time one of our colleagues showed up to a lesson with nothing but blank paper and hadn't completed any work. And Ned looked at him and said, if you were going to be shot at dawn tomorrow, you'd write something. So do it. Just pretend they're going to kill you if you don't write something. And I thought of that so many times. I would literally say, well, I have to do it or Ned's going to kill me. And so I'd write something. And gosh darn it, if sometimes that material, often relatively quickly, but certainly an hour or two in, I'd say, oh, you know what? Actually, this is pretty good. So just turning the faucet on and making something come out, even if it's not, inspiration is definitely the way to go. For me, I've spent the last 25 years of my life primarily being a conductor. And so for me, I find it takes a lot longer to knock that rust off when I write music. I have to sit down and remind myself how to do this thing. And so I think that points to the value of just writing, just because when I do that, when I keep working, I have much better results. We have another question from a YOSA musician. This is from David Escamilla. And David says, hello, Jennifer Higdon. What made you want to be a composer and a musician? And you talked about your journey and that going from a flutist to being a composer, but can you tell us more about what was that? What was the thing that made you say, oh, you know what? This is who I am, or this is who I want to be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have to admit, I was always interested in creative endeavors, but everyone in my family was very involved in visual arts, something totally different than working in classical music. And we really didn't have that much classical music around, but I think something about playing in band when I was in high school really made me wake up to the fact that there were all kinds of music. And I can remember thinking, wow, the communication it felt more visceral. It kind of hit me on a visceral level. I don't know, I'm not sure why, but I knew I needed art of some sort, and music just felt right. It was as if I put on shoes that suddenly fit. I was putting them on for the first time, but they felt worn just right for my foot. And to be honest, I don't think I can work and survive out in the world or do anything without being a creative person in music. It's like I can't live without it. So the creativity is super important. And the trick in life is to find the pair of shoes that work best for you. If it's not in music, you still have the joy of playing for the fun of it, which is fantastic. And I also think if you play an instrument, there are certain neurons in your brain that really, they make pathways that work in all fields, no matter what you're doing. So, but having some sort of art form where you are expressing yourself it's so rewarding. I meet so many people who did play instruments when they were younger and then they stopped, and they come up and they always tell me, oh, I wish I'd kept this up. So sometimes it's also hard to tell when you're young, is this what I want to do with my life? And you may not know that for a lot of years down the road. I mean, I started out as a flute performance major. I thought I was going to go for a job in an orchestra. So the composing thing came around really halfway through my bachelor's degree. So it may take a little while to find the footing, but I will tell you, working in the arts is so rewarding for the soul. I mean, every day I feel like I'm contributing something positive. And that's the thing about music. There's no downside to being in music. Really, the truth is you're putting something out in the world that has meaning for somebody, and most likely a lot of people, because everybody on the planet listens to music. I think it probably started in the womb when you heard your mother's heartbeat. I think it's all actually connected.
Well, you talk about that journey to finding those comfortable shoes. But one of the things that most young musicians, and certainly almost all young musicians' parents, worry about is how does that turn into a career? And in your case, you have, of course, become one of America's most successful classical composers. But I happen to know that in your 20s, you were like the rest of us in, trying to figure out how to buy the next box of macaroni and cheese sometimes. So I'm curious about how do you start that journey? If you think back to that time when you were in grad school or shortly after you finished grad school, how did you build a career as a composer? What advice would you give to young composers about the best ways to find that path?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things I decided, because I grew up in a household where my dad was a commercial artist, it meant I was living in a household where someone had a freelance career, which means that you don't always know where some of your income is going to be. And I can remember my dad telling me all through my childhood that you can do anything you want. You just have to figure out how to make it work. But the big key I discovered along the way was just being persistent and keeping at it. Even when I got knocked off the horse, getting back on the horse and keep going. What happened as I was going through school, I had all these friends, all these people who were with me who took all the same classes I did, but they all kind of peeled off through the years. Either they lost interest, they didn't find it interesting, or they were worried more about money. And the thing I had discovered by watching my dad work was that if you just keep at it, it does unfold in the way that works. It does. Most people don't know that because it's much easier if you're doing training as an accountant, you're going to get the bachelor's degree in accounting and you're going to get a job. So in the arts, it always looks more tenuous. But I have found that if you just stick to the path, and even when people told me that there's no way, they said, you're starting too late, you were self-taught on the flute, you're starting composition too late. Are you crazy? You can't do this. And even when I was going through grad school, my teachers were completely freaked out when I said, I want to freelance. They were like, you can't do that. You can't, you have to get a university job. And I'm like, well, I think I can. I said, I'm willing to eat peanut butter and jelly or the box of macaroni. I'm willing to do whatever I need to be a working artist. And sticking with it, the doors opened. It wasn't always obvious where the doors were going to open. And I understand parents get really nervous about this. They worry about their kids being able to make a living. But looking around and seeing all the various people that I know that I went to school with who are doing all kinds of incredible things artistically, everybody's making it work. It is doable. And the thing is, it feeds your soul. And that's the kind of thing I think about in a lifetime. You get to the end of your life, you don't want to have any regrets. I've never seen anyone regret going off the beaten path and doing something a little different. I have seen people regret staying on the beaten path. So I often think about that. I'm like, well, how will I feel at the end of my life if I don't take this path, if I don't try this? So, but boy, the effort and persistence really, the doors will open. You just have to hang in there. And if it's something that you love, it's worth hanging in for that.
Well, and Jennifer, you may not remember this, but when I was 22 or maybe 23, you actually gave me that advice.
Did I really?
Shortly after I finished at Curtis, and I had applied to the University of Pennsylvania and didn't get in. And I had this year where I was living in Philadelphia and working hourly jobs and just trying to make ends meet. And you and I were spending a lot of time together and collaborating on a few projects, and you were a great friend. And you said this basic thing to me at that point of, here's what my dad said.
Yeah.
And I was so grateful for that, because for me, it absolutely was this thing of just sticking at it and putting one foot in front of the other and taking what I had going on musically and telling other people about it and sharing that story and trying to do better and better work. And so, I've seen you walk that walk, but I want you to know it also had a huge, huge influence in my own life and career. That at kind of my darkest point in terms of worrying about whether or not I could do this thing, you were one of the people who said, yeah, you can do this thing and here's how to do it.
Good.
So,
I'm so glad, Troy.
yeah, no, it was huge. We have another question for you, which is from a YOSA alumnus who's a flutist named Paula Wilson. Paula's a wonderful flutist who's studying at Indiana University.
Mm.
And she asked this great question about how much do you think about the audience? How much do you consider the audience when you're writing music? In class, I learned about composers who specifically wrote functional music and others who were more experimental. Where would you place yourself?
Ah, that's a good question. I always think it's very important to think of the audience, because I realize these people are giving some of their time, their evening or part of the afternoon. And I think music is about communication. I mean, the thing I responded to viscerally was kind of the emotion, the intensity of what I felt when I was listening to music. So I think about that when I'm writing it. There are people who have a very different thought process when they're creating anything. They are looking for something more radical in terms of it being experimental. And it is a balancing act, because a lot of people don't realize that I often in my traditional sounding pieces actually have experimental things in there. Like I use a lot of extended techniques. People are sometimes a little startled when they look at the score. They're like, oh, I had no idea. But the idea is whatever you're doing, to do it convincingly. Even if you go an experimental route, or you decide you're going to be that kind of a composer or someone who plays that kind of music, they're all valid. That's the thing. And I think trying to find that balance, you can only do by trying that balance, because the answer is different for everyone. I know a lot of people expect, if you're studying composition, that you do a lot of this experimenting and kind of figuring out, you know, how much do I push the boundaries? But the thing is, I think you can find the balance. But the only way to find the balance is to kind of go out and feel the edges of the road. And the only way to do that is to either, in your selections of what you're playing or what you're going to write, think about how important is it for the music to communicate to you, the person creating it? How important is it to communicate to the performer? And how important is the audience? And I think that balance is probably different for everybody. And you kind of have to figure it out, what do you want to express? Is it more important that you get some emotion out that you're feeling? And if you're doing that, how much do you want it to say to the audience?
Now, is it different for different pieces, or is it different for different genres? Are you able to be more personal maybe in chamber music than you might be in an opera? Or is it, I mean, you have the voice of Jennifer Higdon. You found who you are. But I wonder, does a different piece or even a different commissioner change that balance for you a little bit?
Yeah, I think it actually, in every instance, it changes. And I remember when I was writing, I got a commission for a junior high band piece called Rhythm Stand that was so hard to write. It was so hard to write. I mean, it really was junior high level. And that one of the things they gave us, all the composers who were doing this, because the idea was they were getting composers who hadn't normally written for this level of band. They gave you a guideline on it. And I had to really think about, is this eighth note pattern going to work for the performers? They're really young performers. And I wrote a piece that wasn't that difficult. However, it was really challenging for the junior high. So in that instance, you're thinking 100% towards your performers. When I write concertos, I'm often thinking of, one, highlighting that soloist, but also highlighting the instrument. What is there a way to show off this instrument to the audience, and maybe in a way that they haven't seen an instrument be highlighted? I mean, violins, they've heard a lot, but when I had to write a bluegrass concerto for the Time for Three guys, that was an interesting thing to be able to kind of make a classical bluegrass hybrid. But also because it was Time for Three and I knew those guys, I really worked to put things in there that were just things that they did alone, all the cool, scratchy sounds that they get when they're improvising, and their bluegrass techniques just pushed a little further than normal. But it is a constantly shifting, and I only take the projects that I think I would be interested in writing. So it always feels like there's a lot of me in there. But I am constantly thinking about the performer and the audience. And it was 100% performers with Rhythm Stand. That was really, I mean, you went, depending on the purpose of the piece, sometimes you really got to sit there and think about, what does this person or this group need? And it's important to kind of go to that place.
Now, I think about, when you talk about extended techniques, I think about the fact that you studied with one of the most heralded American composers in an experimental style, George Crumb, a man who found colors that nobody had ever dreamed of before. And there, on the one hand, there are very few places in your music where I think, oh, this sounds like George, almost none. And yet you have a fluency with extended techniques that not every composer has. Um, did your time with George Crumb play a role in that? And then I'd add on to that, what other people, what other composers have especially influenced you, whether they were people you worked with personally or people you just lived with their scores?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, George Crumb was a huge influence because I think I never really thought about pushing instruments beyond their normal manner of playing. And the sounds that guy gets out of his pieces are just like stunning. And it's kind of funny if you asked him, if you were in a lesson and you asked him, he was pretty modest about it. He's like, oh, I just found it experimenting.
Gosh, Jennifer, I mean, I just thought
Yeah.
that sounded neat.
That's it exactly. It's so dead on. It's kind of incredible, but boy, when you look at his scores, you think, what an imagination. So I immediately thought after staying with him, I need to look at all instruments differently. I need to think they can do a lot more. And it's funny you mentioned this, Troy, because I just turned in an opera, a chamber opera that is for 5 singers and 12 instruments. And every instrument does extended techniques. But one of the things I've had to do is really, really research extended techniques on instruments that I never would have thought about, like horn, extended techniques on the trumpet. I have expanded my palette on the piano. I've been building piano mutes, which are basically extra, extra large men's socks with either plastic BBs in them or a mix of plastic and metal BBs in them. So I'm doing all kinds of things. But in order to do this, and I knew before I started the opera that I wanted a lot of extended techniques. So I had to do like tons of research. I was constantly looking at YouTube videos, figuring out, what people are doing to instruments that make interesting sounds, but are practical to do. So I think expanding your world, and maybe because I grew up around a visual arts family, I was always aware you can change a lot of color and it really makes a difference for the audience, but I have to research it when I'm doing it. And to be honest, there's so much, I guess you could say, music that influences me, composers, and it's almost always that I have to get the nose in through their scores or I hear a recording. I'm an avid collector of CDs, like you can see behind me. These are some of my CDs, about 3,000 of them, but I'm always listening to what my colleagues are doing. And then if I hear something that intrigues me, I try to get a score. I try to get a score so I can really look at how someone's handling a texture or a section, or how did they make it feel like the music was over in 3 minutes, but it was actually a 20-minute piece. So I find that kind of stuff fascinating. And you know what? I couldn't pick out influences, I don't think. I mean, for me, it's so funny. People say, who's the composer who's influenced you the most? And I'd have to say Lennon and McCartney, because I grew up on Beatles music so much that I think my brain is a little wired in the direction of the Beatles. But I can't deny that I listen to all kinds of music. I listen to Alison Krauss, and I listen to bluegrass, and I listen to rap, and I listen to everything.
I remember talking about Prince with you on multiple occasions, and sort of talking about our favorite Prince songs and talking basically about orchestration and arranging, how the textures were set up. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it makes me think about orchestration, which is another area where you excel. I mean, so many younger composers now are studying your scores and looking at how you orchestrate. How did you learn orchestration? I mean, I know you took classes and things like that, but I took those same orchestration classes. They didn't teach me to orchestrate like you orchestrate. So how did you find that palette and develop that fluency?
That's a really good question. I sometimes wonder that because I'd never really thought of myself as a very clever orchestrator, but people started pointing it out. And then I'm like, oh, I guess they find it interesting. I think one of the things that may have really influenced me strangely was playing an orchestra. When I first started playing an orchestra and I sat in the middle of an orchestra doing Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, I don't know, that was like an unreal experience. It was like the most magnificent, serene tornado carrying all of us up into the sound. I was so shocked at what it was like to be inside all of these woodwind runs that were like 30-second notes. And I was sitting there playing them. So I was having to count them, having to pay attention, but I was very aware of all the sounds swelling up around me. So I think playing in ensembles, band, I had a lot of band in my early days, and orchestra was so magical that it made me go, how does that composer make me feel this way? Why am I having this reaction? And so I would get a recording and listen to it. And then I'd be like, wow, I still can't figure it out. So I would look at a score. But one of the things I do is I know in my orchestration, I obsess over constantly varying the colors. And that might have something to do with it, because I sit there and literally say, I think the sound's been going on too long, or this color's been going on too long. And it may have only been like a couple of measures that I'm quickly changing colors. But part of what happens when you write a lot is you start learning about the acoustics, the physics of every instrument, and where it sounds good, what you can push it to do in terms of articulating, or how quiet can they be? You know, is it better for them not to have leaps in the music? So after a while, basically in writing, you also learn this stuff by making hideous mistakes in your writing. So it's a combination of putting yourself out there and taking chances on things that I'm often guessing at. I'm not sure if it's going to be executable or if it's going to sound good. Like when I wrote an oboe solo that was accompanied by 3 trombones, I kept staring at the page thinking, ooh, this may be awful, but it was such a shock when it worked. And I realized that musicians are better now than they've ever been in any time in history. So they have so much control over their instruments that they're pretty good about figuring out a way to make things work. That's something I've learned over time. But it's willing to take chances and never being satisfied, to be quite honest. I mean, everything I write, every phrase, every measure, every choice in orchestration, I'm constantly asking myself, can I make this better? Is this good enough? Can I make it better? And I come back every day to sections looking at it saying, is this the right sound? Is it the right length? Is it the right duration? The right instruments accompanying? And I am constantly changing things. I change things until I can't change anything else in a composition.
We had somebody else who asked a question that was about the cat that passed behind you. A little while ago, we saw a black cat go across the piano. So tell us about your cats.
So the cats are big in my life. I mean, I'm actually my cat's staff. That was Bella. Bella came in here. I don't know if you could hear her talking. I'm hoping the mic didn't pick it up, but she started chatting like crazy. I was thinking about coming up here. I was kind of surprised she didn't make the journey up here, because at some point when I'm on Zoom, normally her tail goes right through the middle of the picture. I have another cat named Squeak, who's an older cat, and he talks all the time. The cat that most people know is Bo, who passed away a couple of years ago, is an orange tabby who used to like to put himself in pictures whenever a photographer was around. Bo would show up. So there's a picture of Bo walking through next to me in a publicity photo, and we didn't set that up. Basically, the cat came through at the moment where the photographer was about to do this publicity shot. And the first time the cat went through, his eyes were closed, and she looked at her camera and she said, "Oh, that's too bad." And I swear that cat turned around and came right back, right back through the photo.
I'm ready for my close-up.
I know. So, you know, he negotiated a good contract. That cat got lots of treats, but I don't know. Cats are fantastic. I love pets because they're so humanizing. And if you had a really rough day composing, you can just sit down with your pet and they'll comfort you, basically.
Absolutely. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I know for all of the YOSA musicians who had a chance to view this, and for all the musicians in general who had a chance to view this, it's a real inspiration to hear about your journey. So we do appreciate that. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to share? Any last things you want to mention?
Yeah, you know what? First of all, follow your passion. That's really, I've been doing a lot of virtual graduation speeches. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you follow your passion. Your passion will lead you on the right path. It may not look like the most obvious path, but that's a big thing. But also during this odd time when we're all having to be careful, remember that life will continue and we will emerge from this, and there will be art and it'll be fantastic and you'll just appreciate it that much more. But I want everyone to be safe and hang in there. It will get better.
Thank you, Jennifer Higdon. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and join us again next week on YOSA Live Chats. We are looking forward to seeing you all come back. Next week, we will have Miguel Harth Bedoya, who is a wonderful Peruvian conductor who is just a great musician and also a great advocate for the music of Latin American composers. So join us next Sunday, May 31st, for a chat with Miguel Harth Bedoya. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.